Welcome back. Welcome back to another episode of the Contagious Culture Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle King. And the goal of this podcast is to help you create ecosystems and environments where people thrive. Look, today's conversation I am so excited about because culture is shaped by the stories that we tell and the ones that we silence. And today's guest has helped shift narratives at the literal highest levels of media, leadership, and influence. She's built platforms that didn't just publish content, they changed who felt seen, who felt heard, who felt valued, but most importantly, who felt included. If you've ever wondered how storytelling can actually transform not only business, not only education, but culture, not just talk about it, then this episode's for you. Ali, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks for inviting me onto your podcast. Excited to be here.
I thank you so much for being here. We're super excited. Before we get started, could you just introduce yourself? Who are you? And what keeps you motivated to continue to do this work?
Yeah, sure. My name is Ali Jackson-Jolley. I am an assistant managing editor at Forbes magazine, Forbes Media. My role is in our editorial leadership team. So I'm on the leadership team of our newsroom. And I wear two hats. I oversee our DEI initiative. So that is anything that is focused on pushing our newsroom to be more reflective of the audience. Or more reflective of society at large and the audience that we know that we need to continue to engage in order to be a sustainable media company. One data point I always mention when I get a chance is the U.S. Census Bureau says that by 2045, the U.S. population will be made up of more people of color than not people of color. And so in my view, any media company that is not therefore taking that very seriously and understanding that they need to change the fabric of who are telling their stories, they are working themselves out of business. They will not have a sustainable business. So that's half of my role. The other half of my role is I oversee our communities at Forbes, and so at Forbes, our communities. Our content areas where we talk to specific communities. That could be Forbes BLK, Forbes Women, Forbes Under 30, a brand new platform that we launched, Forbes Apex, which is our community for Asian American Pacific Islander executives. It's two very different hats that I wear, but I think that they are important that they work together. I don't think that we could, for example, have as successful of a Forbes BLK if at the same time we weren't creating a newsroom that could authentically support that storytelling.
No, that definitely makes sense. And, I have so many questions, especially with the various communities and programming that you all do. But I want to start here. When you think of all of your titles, all of the platforms that you've built, all of the various opportunities that you've created for yourself, but then also for other people, what would you say that the personal experiences, like what are the personal experiences that shaped your belief in storytelling and the fact that it does shift systems?
Yeah, thank you. I love that. I really, really love that question because I've thought about it a lot. Um, I was raised by teachers. I was raised by two teachers. And before I was in journalism, long before I was even had a career, I always, the old fashioned teachers who said, hey, the pencil is mightier than the sword. So I always felt empowered to tell my story, to use my voice, to navigate in that way because of where I came from and what my parents taught me. Right out of college, my first job was on Capitol Hill. I should say my dad was a teacher and he was also a mayor. He was the mayor of the city of Peekskill, so it was a part-time job. So, you didn't make enough money to be a
Yeah.
full-time mayor, nor do I think he ever would have wanted to. So that meant I also knew how to navigate systems, and I was always really interested in impacting society for the better. That's always something I wanted to do. I got into journalism a little bit later in life once I had my kids, and I needed wanted to be home with them, wanted to do something from home. Um, but still needed to make money and still wanted to work. And so I sort of like looked at myself and I was like, well, what can I do that I can do from home, that's using my voice, that using my ability to write? Oh, I know, I'll be a journalist. And it makes me laugh because the first editor a freelance journalist, I should say, the first editor who took a chance on me was sort of like, Ali, I can see that you're a good writer. You're a terrible reporter. She's right. I've never been to never even learned about journalism, but she was like, look, kid, you got something. I can teach you how to do that. I usually tell that story because I think that's super important to think about. People who think about talent differently, right? Who think about someone who maybe didn't have the exact background, but they saw that I had the drive and the skill and the eagerness to learn. Um, Fast forward to 2020, and I know this is a long story, but I do love
Right.
the question. 2020, of course, was that year that many of us in America who are from historically marginalized communities, and particularly the Black community, experienced the murder of George Floyd together, experienced the way the COVID pandemic decimated our communities. And I felt a lot of things. I felt like devastated. I felt angry. I felt sad, but I never felt voiceless. And again, that goes back to that. I was raised by teachers who always taught me how I could intentionally use my voice through writing and then later on through journalism because of that editor. And I sort of at that moment thought, well, what am I doing, Ali? You have the ability, you know how to make change through policy, make change, you know how to like navigate systems. Imagine all of those, for me, it was kids. Imagine all those kids living in historically marginalized communities who are watching in real time George Floyd being murdered and feel voiceless, don't have a voice in journalism, don't have a way to really, talk about what's going on. And so I decided at that point I was going to find a way to use my might to try to make a small change. We all to make whatever change I could. I thought that would be through, I started writing proposals around journalism education for historically marginalized communities in high schools. I wrote up a proposal and I was shopping it around to like the Gates Foundation and places like that. And then just by happenstance, a friend of mine who works for Forbes said, hey, look, we're looking for somebody who would do what you're looking to do, create opportunity for Black and Brown community journalists or aspiring journalists to get into our newsroom and tell stories that aren't always told for the Black community. Why don't you throw your hat in? And I did. And so I am here. And so, this is work that I have 2 kids in college, so I can't do it for free. But to be honest, this is work that if I didn't have to pay for college, I would do for free because it matters so much to me that that those who sometimes feel voiceless no longer, feel like they have a voice, and who don't feel seen or who have historically felt underseen can feel seen. So yeah, great. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to do this stuff for Forbes.
Ali, that gave me chills. And you said something. You said, in 2020, you felt devastated, you felt anger, you felt sadness, but you never felt voiceless. Can you talk to us about why that is and where you learned the boldness to be able to feel and experience all of these feelings, but still, you still leaned into your voice? And can you talk to that person that feels all of these experiences and feelings, these multitude of emotions, but doesn't have that courage to be able to utilize their voice in the way that they would want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the longer I'm at Forbes, the more I realize something I think I've always known, which is you do what you've seen, right? And so a good example of that I think about, Forbes, we cover wealth creators. My family didn't really like talk a lot about investing in real estate and those kind of things, right? So it's sort of like much later in my life that I was like, why am I so scared? Like I know these are like I know all these paths to create generational
Mhm.
wealth. I hear them, but why does it make me so anxious, right? And that's because I learned so many things from the community around me, and specifically my family, but I didn't really learn about investing in things like real estate or other things that could create generational wealth. But I did from a really young age learn about writing and speaking in a way that, and again, my dad was a politician and a teacher, my mom was a teacher. From a really young age, they talked to me about this, and like things like, you want to be heard, here's how you make sure you're heard, right? Like sometimes there's a time for anger and letting people hear that, but there's also a time for clarity. And if you want to really be heard, here's how you do it, whether it's written or or verbally. And so it never felt courageous to me. It just felt natural, and it felt like very empowering. And so again, I have two daughters, two women of color that I'm raising. They're both out of the house. They're not young kids anymore, but at the time they were both in high school in 2020. And so my oldest daughter, who was feeling, all of those things, I said, well, look, let's pen a op-ed together. Let's write an op-ed about, what we're seeing. And some of it was around, some of the performative, for my daughter, it was like we live in Westchester County in the Northeast, very liberal area.
Yeah.
A lot of her friends, non-Black friends, were saying what they thought were the right things, but things that were really harmful to
Mhm.
her psyche. And I was like, well, write not bad. Let people know in a way that's not like attacking, but what is, and so again, was, it didn't feel courageous, but for people who feel like they don't have a voice, I would say you do have a voice. um I would say find people who you can surround yourself, if this is something you're interested with,
Mhm.
people who you see do know how to do this. So find a journalist, find a that you like, follow them, reach out to them, go to your library, find like the writers and the writing groups, surround yourself by those people. But also, I think that's why I do think it's also not just on the people who want a voice, it's on the shoulders of us who have a voice to teach others how to do that. Because I do think, you've got to empower yourself. Of course you do. And there's so much um, brain trust in the Black community now. There's so much wealth in the community now. There's and Black and brown communities, um, that I have no doubt these communities have the ability to use their voice and shape society and ideas. But I also think, knowing again what I said at the beginning, that the things that you don't know come very, very hard. I think that's why I do feel like it's on me as well, on my shoulders, to do what I can to make sure that I'm helping the next generation, feel like it is just as innate as it was to me to use your voice.
I appreciate you saying that because in researching your background, you're known for mentoring, especially rising leaders. What do emerging leaders actually need from senior leadership right now? Not what we think they need, but what do they need, and how can we do a better job at receiving coaching, mentorship, and guidance?
Yeah. So, One of the things that, so let me take a step back. One of the programs that I created at Forbes, which is really my baby, is a program called our HBCU Scholars Program. And it's really just an internship, but it's a little more because it's a little bit more of mentorship built in before these HBCU journalists get to the Forbes newsroom even. So I think that, some of it, and like, because I think maybe this is your point. I don't know. One of the things I think about is that the word like mentoring is really buzzy right now. But I think sometimes it's not as impactful as it could be because sometimes the people who are leading mentorship programs aren't really thinking about what are the barriers and what aren't the barriers, right? And so for me, I think for every industry, it's a little different. For every different like age group, it's a little different. But for me, the way I think about it is if corporations or whoever's trying to mentor young talent, if you trust yourself, so for Forbes, I say this to my colleagues all the time, if our senior editors, if we trust ourselves that we can train best in class business journalists, we don't need to have people completely formed and fully baked out of college with all those skills, right? We should have the ability in our ranks, if we think we're as good as we think we are, and I think Forbes is at telling business journalism stories, then we should be able to take folks who have potential, who are smart and driven and have some talent, sure, because we're a national newsroom, so you have to have some basics, but maybe you don't understand all the ins and outs of how you evaluate wealth, right? But we should trust ourselves to be able to train. And then once we trust ourselves, we should be able to look at talent that comes in that may not have had the exact same path to get here, right? If they, kids who aren't necessarily have done 20 million leadership type activities before they even finished 12th grade, right? And so we should be able to look at them and say, hey, look, but this is a person who's real. I can see through that. I can see this is a really smart person. And then I think what's really important for the person who's being mentored, and I think this is part of what good leadership does, is you say to the mentee, be fearless. Like, don't feel like because you have a mentor, we're doing you a service. Like, like don't make yourself small. Don't feel like overly grateful to the organization. See it for the opportunity it is, and understand that the reason this organization, whether it's Forbes or another organization, is doing it is because your voice is needed. And so therefore, when you think about why your voice is needed, think about the unique perspectives you bring that a 50-year-old Black woman or a 50-year-old white man doesn't know about, whatever, whether it's news or marketing or whatever. Understand why your perspective is important, and don't try to conform to that that corporate culture. Bring that bring that superpower, which is your unique perspective. That was a really long answer. Sorry if I went, but that's sort of how I think about it. Is like I think it's really important, especially for younger, early career professionals who are coming up like this leadership track, to understand how important their perspective is. They're silencing that, right? They're not making themselves just look like everyone else, because that, that, I think that is, you have to understand what your superpower is and when to use it.
Is there a common thread between the multitude of organizations that you've worked with, or in regards to storytelling? And I guess to preface this, you've advised members of Congress, major brands,
Mm-hmm.
built teams.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my question is, how does storytelling show up differently across those spaces?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's just real for me. It's this, you're right. The storytelling is the through line, and it's understanding different audiences and different, it's I guess at the if you go all the way back to the beginning, you sort of say, what am I? It's strategic, right? All strategic
Yeah.
communications, in a way, like, what am I trying to do? Am I trying to tell a story for a newsroom? Am I trying to sell, a product, a consumer good? Am I trying to get a bill passed in Congress?
Yeah.
So what am I trying to do? And who am I trying to reach? Like, who's my audience? And what's the most compelling way that I can get them to understand me? Right. And so that, to me, does go back to, um, in the newsroom. So when you do it as a journalist, it is fact based, right? So the way
Mhm.
you get people to believe you is to be as factual as you can. Forbes, one thing that makes a Forbesian story is that we allow ourselves to take a viewpoint. So we are taking viewpoints, but it's all based on numbers and metrics and stuff
Yeah.
like that. If you're doing it for a member of Congress, there's a little more emotion involved, right? You're
Yeah.
kind of saying, like, how do I get this passed? Like, what are the emotions? And the same thing for, like, a consumer product. So I think that's, it's just like, who's my audience? How do I get the story out there? And then you build back.
Let me ask you this, Ali. Who's your audience, and what's the story that you are working to tell in your own personal or professional life?
Oh, wow. These are good questions. You
Thank
want to come work for me? Want to come work for Forbes?
you. Yeah, we can talk
These are
about
really
it.
good questions. Uh, um, I think I'll start with the easier one, which is what's the story professionally? And that is, um, that there are so many untold stories out there. What an opportunity to tell so many stories that aren't traditionally told, or haven't been traditionally told in business journalism formats. Um, one thing I think about all the time, I go and I talk to a lot of Black journalism students, and they say to me, like, okay, 2020, we promised, all these corporations and newsrooms promised they were going to make these DEI
Mhm.
changes, right? And some of them are pulling them back. Why is this time going to be any different? And the thing that I get the really unique opportunity to see at Forbes through Forbes BLK and Under 30 and other platforms is that we are at this really unique time where there's so much Black wealth and there's so much Black brain trust
Yeah.
that the government should behave in a certain way. Like, the government should not, um, create policies that um, purposefully keep marginalized communities down. But there's enough wealth now and enough Black professionals in very high ranking roles, that the Black community has it in itself to create this change by ourselves. And I think that is one of the things that's really inspiring about being a part of the BLK, Forbes BLK community is that these entrepreneurs and founders and Black executives really understand that it's not so much that we have to sit and wait for the government to do something, or even for these huge corporations too, right? It's sort of like, we can get this done. We have enough there are not enough Black professionals at high ranking board seats, but there are enough Black professionals, there are more than ever, that are in the big banks and we have heading up VC firms and those sort of things, that the Black community feels more empowered to be able to make these changes, make sure that they are being able to make these changes. And I point to myself for that, because, for example, in 2020, when I jumped in, I didn't jump into government. I jumped into business. Like, that's where I was like, I believe that by jumping into a business, business media company, I can make sure these changes are created. So that's really, I think, and maybe I'll let myself off the hook, since that was such a long answer, that I won't answer the personal story, because that is as a journalist, I am not used to answering that story for myself, and I'll have to give that one some more thought.
Exactly. It's interesting that you even brought up DEI, because I think it's a buzzword similar to like mentorship. But what's unique about you is that you've helped shape DEI strategy, and through change management, especially from the editorial side. I guess my question is, for leaders that are listening in, what does real DEI work look like when it's embedded into systems? Like, what does it look like, and what do organizations usually get wrong?
Yeah, I mean, when it's embedded in systems, it's tied into everything, right? So it's not just a DEI initiative, or it's not just pipelining, right? It's not just talent pipelining. It's certainly not just talent pipelining at the junior level. It's and it's not even just mentorship or executive career pathing. It's also tying to the business, tying it into every piece of the business, right? So so that there are revenue goals, and I don't mean DEI goals. I mean, so for example, the way I started by saying, I think newsrooms are working themselves out of business if they are not telling more stories about Black and brown and historically marginalized people, right? So that DEI has to be tied into, how are we reaching more audience? How are we telling more stories outside of the newsroom? How are we working with more brands that are interested in telling diverse stories? How are we supporting? How are we making sure that we're sourcing Black and brown, and our supply chain is not the same? How are our live event when we live events? How are our audiences in our live events changing to make sure that there are Black and brown and historically marginalized people? So there's no shortcut, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I do think a lot of companies are doing the hard work and getting it right. And there are a lot of corporations that have pulled back on DEI, but you know what? There's a lot more that haven't, that are just being a little more quiet now. And so, as a reporter or as an editor who's, looking for folks to report on the companies that are doing it right and aren't doing it right, is it frustrating that we can't get more CEOs and head of organizations to talk about what they're doing? Of course it is, but strategically, I get it, right? Because it's like, by talking about it, they're putting their necks on the line. But I do think that there are companies that understand this is the long game. The thing that I think that this country has gotten wrong for so many years is we've treated DEI like it's, something, something happens in the news and we throw a couple of programs at something and we expect to feel good immediately about doing that because we did the right thing, and then we expect to see immediate change and immediate like bumps in revenue and stuff like that. But the fact is that this is any kind of change. To make any kind of real sustainable change, you're playing the long game, and you have to understand no change is linear. Like you have, you go up and you go down, but as long as you're over time trending in the right direction, then you're going to get there.
What gives you hope about, I guess, the future of leadership, storytelling, equity as you look ahead?
Yeah. I always say that if you're in the change business, you have to be an optimist. And so I am an optimist, right? Because otherwise, why are you doing it? Like, if you don't think that you can really make the change, what are you doing with your time? So I am an optimist. The things that make me really optimistic are that I do see how, I mean, listen, you and I, before the cameras were rolling, you were telling me about all the things you've done, all of the businesses you've launched and then sold, and and so I think that there are so many Black and brown Americans that are in these spaces that they weren't in before, and that are thinking about not just, Black Americans have been entrepreneurs for quite a while, but they have not scaled in the way other entrepreneurs have. So I see more Black and brown Americans thinking about scaling business. They think about creating generational wealth. They think about, and then because the Black community does have this really long history of community investment, I think that's a place that is a shining spot for us. So when you do have like the Robert Smiths and other billionaires, they are reaching back and investing in the community. So that makes me optimistic. I think from from leadership, this next generation makes me really, really optimistic. I think about myself and a lot of the internal challenges. So, like there's like the external, what you face, but then there's also like that internal, what's holding you back because of who you are and how you were raised. I'm a 52-year-old woman. Like, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and that was a time where, your parents, with the most love in their heart, said to you things like, look to your right and your left. Your peers aren't going to, it's going to be so hard to, even if they're white, be as successful as they are. You've got to be 10 times better. You've got to, and then this implicit, I think, as a Black woman, idea, you've got to make people really comfortable around you, right? That's how you rise the ranks, because again, the 70s and the 80s, not necessarily the year 2025 as much. You got to really charm people. You got to make sure they're comfortable around you. You can't shine too bright. And that's something that it's taken me years to get past. But I notice that this younger generation, they don't struggle with that as much.
No, we're disruptors. We kind of just
you don't. And I think that makes me really optimistic, that knowing your worth and not feeling like you got to dim your shine, I think is head and shoulders ahead of where Gen Xers were. So
let me ask you this, Ali, and I'm interested for your response. You've told a lot of stories in your career. What is that story that you'll never forget that you told, that truly touched you, that you carry with you still today?
Oh my God, there's so many. Okay. The favorite stories I've told. Oh, So, one of the stories that I think really moved me that we were able to tell at Forbes, um, was written by our education reporter in 2022. And it was like a very Forbesian story because, we follow the money. That's how we tell our stories. But it was about how historically underfunded Black universities have been, right? And that's not something that's necessarily new to the Black, the Black community, I think, thinks about that a lot, but it was the ability to actually quantify it in the way that Forbes does. So to say, like, dollar for dollar, look at what historically white universities have gotten, and let's take a look at what historically Black colleges have gotten, and, like, let's really understand that all of the successes that these HBCUs have had have been in the face of all of this, like, inequity. So I think that one really, to be able to quantify it in that way, really meant a lot to me. Another thing personally that was really, really impactful to me in 2022, maybe, we did a series called Journey to Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is, of course, the original Black Wall Street, which was then, decimated by race riots and burnt down. But these, and it is now becoming another, like, mecca of Black tech, right? And so, to tell it, we what we kind of did is like an experiential. We brought about 50 of our community members out to Tulsa and brought them to, like, the Tulsa Museum and some of those things, but then did a lot of, networking and ecosystem building as well. And so that was really, that I think that was one of those we call, like, live journalism. So some stuff that was happening in real time, and then that turned into actual, like, physical stories. But that was something where I sat there and I was like, oh my gosh, I want my girls to come and do this. I wish they could be here with me. I wish my dad could be here watching this with me. Like, I guess for me, like, the indicator that a story is something that is so powerful is when I'm like, oh God, if my girls were only here to set this.
No, definitely.
And so that was one. In fact, you're reminding me that we need to do another one of those and see what's going out in Tulsa right now.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I think that it's those stories that keep me doing the work that I'm doing, especially within the educational and nonprofit realm. It's the story of the student that didn't have the technology or resources or parents, and we connected them with a donor. And then they're now able to have that technology, go to college. And because of that initial investment into them, they were able to graduate and be the first in their family to graduate. It's those small stories where you can see the mother that didn't believe that the school system or the nonprofit would really be able to support them. And then you see the transformation of where that child was. And similar to you, it's the children's stories for me that kind of carry with me still today. When you approach stories, I want to know, like, do you use a framework that you could share? And, how do you tell better stories? What would be your advice if I'm a nonprofit leader or a culture builder or a founder? How do I go about telling my story? What would be that step-by-step
well,
process?
you know what? You kind of hit on it when you said your favorite stories are about, I think you said you said the mother and the student, stories. The best stories are about people, right? That the best stories are about people, and the stories that people, audiences, engage with, and those stories that resonate the most with them are the stories that are about people. And so, we always say at Forbes, we tell business stories, but at the center of them, it's people, right? And so I think that, for non but you know this again, because you said that you exactly hit the nail on the head. For nonprofit leaders or for business leaders, for brand executives, find that human story and then build whatever you're trying to say around it. So like for a business journalist, find that human story, that individual story or story of individuals, and then make it be a microcosm of the larger thing you're trying to tell.
Let me ask you this, Ali, and I asked the question similar earlier, but it's the opposite end. What's a story that you've been wanting to tell that you haven't?
You must have been a journalist. Were you a journalist before you were?
No, I think, similar to how I approach fundraising, I'm genuinely curious. And I think if I could define storytelling in one word, it would be curiosity.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. That's what that is, curiosity and a little bit of skepticism is what I say makes a good journalist, curiosity, and then what are you saying and what aren't you saying? Okay.
Yep.
So for me, the story that I still want to tell that I haven't told yet. Okay. So one thing we mentioned, we were chatting a little bit before we started this behind the scenes, and one thing that we have in common, I know, is that we think about education sort of as what really drives us, or what drives you, and I'll say for me as well, like that education for me right now, journalism education and opportunities. But so I'm really, really, really interested in the changing landscape of education. My parents, as I mentioned, were both public school teachers, but I see some it's not new. There's been a movement over the past few decades for charter schools and those sort of things. And I think with some really good results, but also sometimes some troubling results as well. So like at what cost? There's some charter schools everywhere, but I'm in New York, so I'll point to a couple in New York where they're very, very regimented and almost militaristic. Say that word for me. Well, they're almost like a military school.
I got you.
And at very, very, very young ages. And yet, they're graduating kids who were failing out. So on one hand, there is success, but, I think, what's the cost of treating a kindergartner like they're in a military school when most of the best thought leaders in education talk about, at that age at least, play as learning, right? And so so that's a story I'd like to dig into. And then, from the business perspective, because a lot of these charter schools are, if you look at the boards, many of these charter schools are, wealth creators, many who don't look like the communities that these schools are in. And so I'd love to understand, what is going on in these boardrooms when people are talking about education and how to make societies, how to make students in Harlem, New York, and, parts in Brooklyn that have historically failing schools, what are those conversations? Are they thinking about the bottom line only? Of course, that's the thing about some of these charter schools is that they are for-profit schools, and that's okay. But there's not much transparency, and so I would love to get a reporter in to really, be a fly on the wall and hear what they're talking about from a very, very, very selfishly personal standpoint. The one story I'll tell before I retire is I'll get in a room with Barack Obama and I'll interview him.
Yes.
He hasn't accepted that interview yet, but before I retire,
we're working on it. No, I love that. And you know what what you said, I wrote down the cost of conformity. As a a former school teacher, school leader, board member, um, what are we really it's kind of like what are we doing to our students by conforming them to one idea and one way of thinking, one way of dressing, one way of doing? Um, what are we really creating in regards to the next generation of these future leaders that will go off and create the solutions to the challenges potentially that we're even creating today. And even from a board standpoint on the investment side, I definitely understand how the focus on enrollment and metrics have been um, highlighted much more than the ability to create equitable spaces where students can truly create an ecosystem for them to be able to thrive.
Yeah,
Ali,
right.
this conversation has been amazing, and I'm
I
sure
yeah,
we could talk
wait, yeah,
for a
you and
long
I should go
time.
grab a cup of coffee and keep doing this
Definitely,
off camera. But
definitely.
yeah, no, I really appreciate having the opportunity to come and chat with you. And yeah, listen, maybe we'll change places and I'll have you in the Forbes studio. We can do this and I can put you in the hot seat next time.
Hey, whenever you have time, let me know. Ali, where can people find you, and what's next for you?
Yeah, so you can find me Forbes.com, Ali Jackson-Jolley. I have I have my own I have my own Forbes.com page there. Or, if you're a Black entrepreneur or business leader, go check out Forbes BLK, become a member. It's free. Definitely come to our next summit, which will be next October. We haven't figured out a date yet, but that is something not to be missed. Um, what's next that I'm excited about? So we're Jabari Young, who is the lead editor for Forbes BLK, launched his inaugural Forbes BLK list last year. It was about power, wealth, and impact.
Mm,
This year, his list is focused, and his storytelling is really around Black funders, so Black venture capitalists and Black PE, private equity
mhm.
funders, and I think that's really important um, to get the word out. And
Of
what
course.
we're hoping ultimately is then to bring founders, people who are looking for funders into the space. So back to at the beginning, you talked about um, ecosystem building. Like, to me,
Yep.
this is like the perfect ecosystem building. Let's highlight the biggest Black funders in America. Let's bring in some really great tech founders and other kind
Love
of
it.
founders. Let's match them up and let's see what kind of magic we can create.
Well, let me know when the magic is creating because I want to be in the room, Ali.
Yeah,
That is
alternate.
amazing.
You're going to get an invitation.
I love it. I appreciate you so much. And for our audience, culture spreads through conversation. Today's conversation reminds us that leadership isn't just about scale, it's about who rises with you. Ali, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for building platforms that don't just inform, but transform people's lives, transform people's community, and sets the seed to be able to transform our economy. If you are listening in and you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, like, and share this episode with somebody. And one of the questions that I always ask is, what type of culture are you spreading? Culture isn't anything and is everything. The energy you bring is the culture you create. Make yours worth catching. My name is Kyle King. I'm the host of the Contagious Culture Podcast. We'll see you all next episode.